Imagine two mighty cities locked in a struggle that would reshape the ancient world forever. Athens, the brilliant democracy with its towering walls and unstoppable navy, faced off against Sparta, the warrior state whose soldiers never retreated. What began as a clash between these titans would drag all of Greece into nearly 3 decades of bloodshed, betrayal, and tragedy. This is the story of the Peloponnesian War, a conflict so devastating that it ended the golden age of Greece and changed the course of Western civilization. It's a tale of brilliant strategies and catastrophic blunders, of heroes and villains, of democracy versus oligarchy, and ultimately of how pride and ambition can destroy even the mightiest empires. To understand this epic conflict, we must first journey back to a Greece emerging from its greatest triumph. In 480 BCE, the massive Persian invasion under Xerxes had been decisively defeated. At Salamis, Athenian ships had shattered the Persian fleet. At Plataea, Greek hoplites had crushed the Persian army. The impossible had happened. Tiny Greece had humbled the world's greatest empire. But victory brought new challenges. The Persian threat wasn't completely eliminated, and someone needed to continue the fight. Athens, flush with naval success, stepped forward to lead a new alliance called the Delian League. What began as a voluntary confederation of Greek cities would gradually transform into something far more sinister, an Athenian empire. The transformation was subtle at first. Cities contributed ships or money to the common cause. Athens, with its superior naval expertise, naturally took command of joint operations. The League's treasury, initially housed on the sacred island of Delos, was moved to Athens for safekeeping. When some cities tried to leave the alliance, Athens forced them to stay, claiming that abandoning the fight against Persia was treason to all Greeks. Meanwhile, Sparta watched these developments with growing unease. The Spartans had always been a land-based power, content to dominate the Peloponnese through their network of allies. They had no desire for overseas adventures or naval supremacy. But they couldn't ignore the reality that Athens was becoming dangerously powerful. The Spartan system was unique in the Greek world. Their entire society was organized around warfare. Male citizens were taken from their families at age 7 and trained in brutal military schools. They lived in barracks, ate simple meals, and devoted their lives to becoming perfect soldiers. This system produced the finest heavy infantry in the world, but it also made Sparta deeply conservative and suspicious of change. Athens represented everything Sparta feared. It was a democracy where common citizens could speak in the assembly and influence policy. It was a commercial power that welcomed foreigners and new ideas. It was innovative, ambitious, and seemingly unstoppable. To traditional Spartans, Athens embodied dangerous chaos that threatened the natural order. The first serious clash came in 460 BCE, during what historians call the First Peloponnesian War. This earlier conflict was more limited in scope, but it established the pattern of Athenian-Spartan rivalry. Athens supported democratic revolutions, while Sparta backed oligarchic governments. Each side built networks of allies and client states, turning local disputes into proxy wars. The peace treaty of 445 BCE was supposed to settle these tensions for 30 years. Both sides agreed to respect each other's spheres of influence and submit disputes to arbitration. For a while, it seemed to work. Athens focused on building its empire and beautifying the city with monuments like the Parthenon. Sparta dealt with internal problems, including a devastating earthquake and a major slave revolt. But beneath the surface, tensions continued to build. Athens grew richer and more powerful each year. The tribute from subject cities funded not just military expansion, but also cultural achievements that made Athens the envy of the Greek world. The city attracted philosophers, artists, and intellectuals from across the Mediterranean. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens seemed to embody the best of Greek civilization. This golden age, however, came at a cost. The Athenian Empire was built on the forced contributions of subject cities. When Naxos tried to leave the Delian League in 470 BCE, Athens besieged the city and forced it back into submission. When Thasos rebelled in 465 BCE, Athens crushed the revolt and imposed harsh terms. The message was clear: membership in the Athenian Empire was permanent. Sparta's allies grew increasingly alarmed by Athenian expansion. Corinth, one of Sparta's most important partners, found its trade routes threatened by Athenian naval power. Megara, caught between Athens and Sparta, faced economic pressure from both sides. Thebes, the leading city in Boeotia, resented Athenian interference in its regional affairs. The system of Greek city-states had always been competitive and fractious. But the rise of Athens and Sparta as superpowers transformed local rivalries into existential struggles. Smaller cities were forced to choose sides, knowing that neutrality was becoming impossible. The final crisis began in an unlikely place, the distant city of Epidamnus on the Adriatic coast. In 435 BCE, this small trading post was torn apart by civil war between democrats and oligarchs. The democrats appealed to Corcyra, their mother city, for help. When Corcyra refused, they turned to Corinth, Corcyra's mother city. This created an impossible situation. Corinth agreed to help Epidamnus, but Corcyra saw this as interference in its sphere of influence. The dispute escalated when Corcyra's powerful navy defeated a Corinthian fleet at the Battle of Leucima in 435 BCE. Suddenly, a local conflict had drawn in major powers. Corcyra, realizing that Corinth would seek revenge, made a fateful decision. Despite having remained neutral in Greek politics for generations, they appealed to Athens for an alliance. The Athenian assembly faced a difficult choice. Helping Corcyra would anger Corinth and, by extension, Sparta. But Corcyra had the second-largest navy in Greece, an asset Athens couldn't ignore. Pericles argued that war with Sparta was inevitable anyway. Better to gain Corcyra as an ally now than face their combined fleets later. The assembly agreed to a defensive alliance, promising to help Corcyra only if Corinth attacked first. The Battle of Sybota in 433 BCE brought Athens and Corinth into direct conflict. When Corinthian ships seemed on the verge of destroying the Corcyrian fleet, Athenian vessels intervened. Though both sides claimed victory, the message was clear. Athens and Sparta's allies were now fighting each other. The situation deteriorated further when Athens imposed the Megarian decree in 432 BCE. This economic embargo banned Megarian merchants from Athenian markets and ports throughout the empire. For Megara, a city that depended on trade, this was economic warfare. Sparta's allies demanded action, arguing that Athens was using its imperial power to strangle smaller cities. The final straw came at Potidaea, a city that was both an Athenian ally and a Corinthian colony. When Athens demanded that Potidaea expel Corinthian magistrates and tear down part of its walls, the city rebelled. Corinth sent volunteers to help defend Potidaea, leading to a siege that would last for 3 years and cost Athens enormous resources. In the summer of 432 BCE, Sparta's allies gathered to demand action against Athens. The Corinthians delivered a passionate speech, arguing that Athenian aggression threatened the freedom of all Greeks. They warned that if Sparta didn't act now, Athens would become too powerful to stop. The Spartan assembly was divided. King Archidamus, an experienced leader, counseled caution. He pointed out that Sparta lacked the naval power to challenge Athens directly and that a long war would favor the richer, more populous Athenian empire. But the war party, led by the Ephos Thenelaidas, argued that Spartan honor demanded action. The vote was close, but the decision was for war. Sparta sent an ultimatum to Athens: lift the siege of Potidaea, revoke the Megarian decree, and restore autonomy to the Greek cities. The message was clear: submit or fight. Pericles convinced the Athenian assembly to reject these demands. In a famous speech, he argued that yielding to Spartan threats would only invite further demands. Athens had built its empire through strength and determination. It would not surrender it through fear. As winter approached in 432 BCE, both sides prepared for war. Sparta sent embassies throughout Greece, calling on cities to join the fight for Greek freedom. Athens strengthened its defenses and recalled its scattered fleets. The greatest conflict in Greek history was about to begin. When Spartan forces crossed into Athenian territory in the spring of 431 BCE, they expected a quick victory. The traditional pattern of Greek warfare involved brief campaigns where armies met in decisive battles. Sparta's military reputation was so fearsome that many enemies surrendered without fighting. But Pericles had a different strategy. Instead of meeting the Spartans in open battle, Athens would withdraw behind its long walls, massive fortifications that connected the city to its port at Piraeus. Supplied by its navy and protected by its walls, Athens could outlast any siege while using its fleet to strike at Spartan allies. This strategy was brilliant in theory, but devastating in practice. As Spartan armies burned their farms and destroyed their olive groves, Athenian farmers watched helplessly from the city walls. The countryside that had fed Athens for generations was systematically devastated. Refugees crowded into the city, creating unsanitary conditions that would soon prove catastrophic. The first year of war followed Pericles' plan perfectly. Spartan forces ravaged Attica, but couldn't force Athens to fight. Meanwhile, Athenian fleets raided the Peloponnesian coast, showing that Sparta's allies were vulnerable to naval attack. The siege of Aegina demonstrated Athens' ability to project power throughout the Aegean. But the human cost was enormous. Families that had farmed the same land for generations watched their ancestral homes burn. The psychological impact of seeing their territory occupied while they remained passive behind walls was almost unbearable for proud Athenians. The naval war, however, showed Athens at its best. At the Battle of Rhium in 429 BCE, the brilliant Admiral Phormio demonstrated the superiority of Athenian seamanship. With just 20 ships, he defeated a Spartan fleet of 47 vessels by using superior tactics and taking advantage of local wind patterns. The victory was so complete that it became legendary throughout Greece. Phormio's second victory at Naupactos was even more impressive. Caught by surprise by a larger Spartan fleet, the Athenians seemed doomed. But Phormio rallied his scattered ships and turned near defeat into stunning victory. These battles proved that Athens could dominate the seas even when outnumbered. The siege of Plataea became a symbol of the war's brutality. This small city, Athens' oldest ally, found itself surrounded by Spartan forces in 429 BCE. The defenders, knowing that surrender meant death, held out for 2 years, under increasingly desperate conditions. They ate leather, boiled grass, and eventually resorted to cannibalism. When Plataea finally fell in 427 BCE, the Spartans showed no mercy. Every male defender was executed, and the women were sold into slavery. The city that had stood with Athens at Marathon was wiped from the map. The message was clear: this war would be fought without quarter. Just as Athens seemed to be successfully implementing Pericles' strategy, disaster struck from an unexpected quarter. In 430 BCE, a terrible plague swept through the overcrowded city. The disease, possibly typhus or bubonic plague, killed perhaps a third of Athens' population over the next 4 years. The plague didn't discriminate between rich and poor, citizen and slave. It struck down the young and healthy as readily as the old and weak. Families were wiped out in days. The dead piled up in the streets because there weren't enough living to bury them. Social order began to break down as people abandoned traditional customs and moral restraints. Thucydides, who survived the plague himself, left a chilling description of its effects. He wrote of people throwing themselves into wells to quench their burning fever, of bodies lying unburied in temples, of the complete breakdown of religious and social customs. The plague, he observed, was more destructive than any enemy army. Among the victims was Pericles himself, who died in 429 BCE. His death was a catastrophe for Athens that went far beyond the loss of a single leader. Pericles had been the architect of Athenian strategy and the one man who could control the democratic assembly. Without his steady hand, Athens began to pursue more aggressive and riskier policies. The plague also had profound psychological effects. Many Athenians saw it as divine punishment for starting the war. Others blamed Pericles for crowding the population behind the walls. The careful defensive strategy that might have won the war was increasingly questioned by citizens who wanted more aggressive action. Religious faith, always important in Greek society, was shaken by the plague's random destruction. If the gods were just, why did they allow the innocent to suffer alongside the guilty? Traditional festivals were abandoned, and many people turned to foreign cults or abandoned religion altogether. After Pericles' death, Athenian politics became more volatile and unpredictable. The assembly, no longer guided by his steady leadership, swung between extremes of caution and aggression. New leaders emerged who promised quick victories and easy solutions to the war's mounting costs. Cleon, a wealthy tanner who became the most influential politician after Pericles, represented a new type of Athenian leader. Unlike the aristocratic Pericles, Cleon was a populist who appealed directly to the common people. He promised to prosecute the war more vigorously and to make Athens' enemies pay for their defiance. Under Cleon's influence, Athens began to abandon Pericles' defensive strategy. Instead of simply outlasting Sparta, Athens would actively seek to destroy its enemies. This more aggressive approach would lead to some spectacular successes and some catastrophic failures. The revolt of Mytilene in 428 BCE provided the first test of this new approach. When this important city on Lesbos tried to leave the Athenian Empire, the assembly voted to execute all adult males and enslave the women and children. A ship was dispatched with these brutal orders. But the next day, the assembly reconsidered. In a famous debate between Cleon and Diodotus, the question was whether mercy or severity better served Athenian interests. Cleon argued that harsh punishment would deter future revolts. Diodotus countered that moderate treatment would encourage cities to surrender quickly rather than fight to the death. The assembly narrowly voted to reverse its decision. A second ship raced to Mytilene and arrived just in time to prevent the massacre. Only the ringleaders of the revolt were executed. This debate revealed the moral complexity of imperial rule and the difficulty of balancing justice with political necessity. In 425 BCE, Athens achieved what seemed impossible. They captured Spartan warriors alive. The opportunity arose almost by accident when an Athenian fleet was forced to take shelter at Pylos, a rocky promontory on the Spartan coast. The Athenian general Demosthenes decided to fortify the position, creating a permanent base in Spartan territory. The Spartans were horrified by this development. Enemy forces operating from Pylos could encourage Helot revolts and raid Spartan territory at will. They immediately moved to recapture the position, landing troops on the nearby island of Sphacteria to prevent Athenian reinforcements. But the Spartan plan backfired spectacularly. When the Athenian fleet returned, it trapped the Spartan force on Sphacteria. For the first time in memory, Spartan soldiers were cut off and facing capture. The psychological impact was enormous. Spartans were supposed to return with their shields or on them, never as prisoners. The siege of Sphacteria lasted for months. Sparta, desperate to save its trapped soldiers, offered peace terms that would have ended the war on favorable terms for Athens. But Cleon, sensing complete victory, demanded that Sparta surrender all its conquests and become an Athenian ally. When the Spartans refused these impossible terms, Cleon boasted that he could capture Sphacteria within 20 days. To everyone's surprise, he succeeded. Using innovative tactics that combined light troops with traditional hoplites, the Athenians overran Spartan positions and captured 120 survivors. The capture of Spartan warriors sent shockwaves throughout Greece. Sparta's military reputation had been built on the belief that its soldiers never surrendered. Now Athenian propaganda could point to Spartan prisoners as proof that even the mighty could fall. The prisoners became Athens' most valuable bargaining chip. Sparta, terrified that its captured soldiers would be executed, agreed to a 1-year truce and sent repeated embassies begging for their return. For the first time in the war, Athens held all the advantages. Success at Pylos made many Athenians believe that total victory was within reach. If Sparta could be humbled so completely, why not expand Athenian power even further? The island of Sicily, with its rich cities and strategic location, seemed like the perfect target for Athenian ambitions. The opportunity arose in 415 BCE when the Sicilian city of Segesta appealed to Athens for help against its neighbor Selinus. Segesta claimed to have vast wealth that could fund an Athenian expedition, and they painted a picture of Sicily ripe for conquest. The proposal divided Athens. Nicias, a cautious general who had negotiated the peace of 421 BCE, warned against the dangers of fighting on multiple fronts. Sicily was far from Athens, he argued, and its conquest would require enormous resources that Athens couldn't spare. But Alcibiades, the brilliant and ambitious nephew of Pericles, saw Sicily as the key to Athenian greatness. If Athens could conquer Sicily, he argued, it would have the resources to defeat Sparta decisively. The wealth of Sicilian cities would fund fleets that could dominate the entire Mediterranean. The assembly was captivated by Alcibiades' vision. Here was a chance not just to win the current war, but to establish Athenian hegemony over the entire Greek world. The vote for the Sicilian expedition was overwhelming, despite Nicias's warnings about its risks. The expedition that sailed from Piraeus in 415 BCE was the largest force Athens had ever assembled. Over 100 triremes carried 5,000 hoplites and thousands of support troops. The flower of Athenian youth sailed west with dreams of glory and conquest. But even before the fleet reached Sicily, disaster struck. Alcibiades, the expedition's most charismatic leader, was recalled to face charges of religious sacrilege. Rather than return to certain death, he fled to Sparta, where he would use his intimate knowledge of Athenian plans to help his former enemies. What followed in Sicily was one of the greatest military disasters in ancient history. The Athenian expedition, deprived of Alcibiades' leadership and facing unexpectedly strong resistance, became bogged down in a lengthy siege of Syracuse. The Syracusans, led by the brilliant general Hermocrates, proved far more capable than the Athenians had expected. They built counter-walls to block Athenian siege works, developed new naval tactics to counter Athenian superiority at sea, and appealed successfully to Sparta for help. Alcibiades' defection proved catastrophic for Athens. Not only did he reveal Athenian plans to the enemy, but he also convinced Sparta to send a general named Gylippus to help Syracuse. Under Gylippus's leadership, the Syracusan resistance stiffened dramatically. The siege dragged on for 2 years, consuming enormous Athenian resources. Reinforcements were sent under Demosthenes, but even these fresh troops couldn't break the deadlock. Worse, the Athenians found themselves increasingly trapped as Syracusan forces gained control of the surrounding territory. The final disaster came in 430 BCE when the Athenians attempted to retreat by sea. Their fleet, weakened by years of fighting and blocked by Syracusan ships, was destroyed in the harbor of Syracuse. Those who escaped the naval battle tried to retreat overland, but were hunted down and captured. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of Athenians died in Sicilian quarries, worked to death under brutal conditions. The cream of Athenian youth, the men who should have led the city for the next generation, perished far from home. The expedition that was supposed to make Athens master of the Mediterranean instead crippled the city's military power. The Sicilian disaster transformed the strategic situation completely. Athens, which had seemed on the verge of total victory just a few years earlier, now fought for survival. Sparta, emboldened by Athenian weakness, launched a new phase of the war with Persian financial support. The key change was Sparta's decision to build a permanent fort at Deceleia, just 20 miles from Athens. This base, established on Alcibiades' advice, allowed Spartan forces to raid Athenian territory year-round. The economic damage was enormous. Athens lost control of its silver mines and saw thousands of slaves desert to the enemy. Even more dangerous was Sparta's new naval strategy. Using Persian gold, the Spartans built a fleet that could challenge Athenian control of the Aegean. For the first time in the war, Athens faced the possibility of losing its maritime empire. The revolt of Athenian allies accelerated after the Sicilian disaster. Cities that had remained loyal for decades saw an opportunity to break free from Athenian control. Chios, Miletus, and other important allies declared independence, forcing Athens to fight on multiple fronts. Internal politics in Athens became increasingly unstable. In 411 BCE, oligarchs seized power in a coup, establishing the government of the 400. This regime promised to negotiate peace with Sparta, but it was overthrown after just 4 months by Democrats who accused it of treason. The return of Alcibiades added another dramatic twist to the war's final phase. Falling out with the Spartans, he convinced the Athenian fleet at Samos to recall him from exile. His charismatic leadership helped Athens win several crucial naval victories that briefly restored hope. Despite their desperate situation, the Athenians showed remarkable resilience in the war's final years. A series of brilliant naval victories in the Hellespont demonstrated that Athenian seamanship remained superior, even when resources were limited. The Battle of Cynossema in 411 BCE saw an outnumbered Athenian fleet defeat a larger Spartan force through superior tactics and seamanship. The victory was so unexpected that many Athenians could hardly believe the news when it reached the city. Even more impressive was the victory at Cyzicus in 410 BCE, where Alcibiades led a combined land and sea assault that destroyed an entire Spartan fleet. The Spartan admiral Mindarus was killed, and his surviving ships were captured or destroyed. A captured Spartan message summed up the disaster. Ships lost, Mindarus dead, men starving, don't know what to do. These victories allowed Athens to regain control of the Hellespont, the vital waterway through which grain ships reached the city. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Athens might yet snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. The Battle of Arginissae in 406 BCE was Athens' last great naval victory. Despite being outnumbered, the Athenian fleet defeated the Spartans so completely that Spartan naval power in the Aegean was temporarily broken. The victory was so decisive that Sparta again offered peace terms. But the aftermath of Arginissae revealed how the long war had corrupted Athenian democracy. When a storm prevented the rescue of survivors from damaged ships, the assembly voted to execute the victorious generals for negligence. This judicial murder deprived Athens of its most experienced naval commanders just when they were needed most. The end came at Aegospotami in 405 BCE, where Spartan Admiral Lysander caught the Athenian fleet completely unprepared. For 4 days, the Athenians had drawn up their ships for battle, only to beach them each evening when the Spartans refused to fight. On the 5th day, most of the Athenian crews had gone ashore to forage for food when Lysander suddenly attacked. The Athenian fleet was destroyed almost without a fight, 170 ships captured and their crews executed. Only 9 ships escaped to carry news of the disaster to Athens. The Battle of Aegospotami was more than a military defeat. It was the end of Athenian naval supremacy. Without a fleet, Athens couldn't protect its grain supply or maintain its empire. The city that had ruled the seas was now trapped behind its walls, slowly starving. Lysander systematically reduced Athenian strongholds throughout the Aegean. One by one, the cities of the Athenian Empire surrendered or were captured. The tribute that had funded Athenian greatness now flowed to Sparta instead. As winter approached in 405 BCE, Athens faced a terrible choice: surrender or starve. The city's food supplies dwindled as Spartan ships blockaded the harbor. Children cried from hunger while their parents debated whether to continue a hopeless resistance. When Athens finally surrendered in April 404 BCE, many expected the city to be completely destroyed. Corinth and Thebes, remembering decades of Athenian oppression, demanded that the city be razed and its population enslaved. But Sparta showed unexpected mercy. Remembering Athens' role in the Persian Wars, the Spartans decided to spare the city that had once stood with them against foreign invasion. The long walls were torn down, the fleet was reduced to 12 ships, and the empire was dissolved. But Athens itself survived. The mercy came with conditions that humiliated the proud democracy. Sparta installed a puppet government known as the 30 Tyrants, led by Critias, a former student of Socrates. This regime ruled through terror, executing political opponents and confiscating property to reward Spartan supporters. The 30 Tyrants proved so brutal that they sparked a civil war within Athens. Democratic exiles, led by Thrasybulus, launched a guerrilla campaign from the border fortress of Philae. Gradually, they gained support from Athenians who had initially welcomed the end of the war. The civil war that followed was as vicious as the international conflict that had preceded it. Families were divided, old friends became enemies, and the city that had once been united against foreign foes tore itself apart. The restoration of democracy in 403 BCE brought peace, but couldn't heal the deep wounds left by years of internal strife. The Peloponnesian War's toll went far beyond military casualties and political changes. An entire generation of Greeks had grown up knowing only conflict, suspicion, and violence. The confident, optimistic world that had defeated Persia was replaced by one marked by cynicism and exhaustion. The war had revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature and political power. The famous Melian dialogue, recorded by Thucydides, captured the brutal realism that had replaced earlier ideals. When the small island of Melos tried to remain neutral, Athens coldly explained that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Traditional Greek values of honor, justice, and moderation had been casualties of the long conflict. Cities that had once prided themselves on their civilization committed atrocities that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The massacre at Melos, where every adult male was killed and the women and children enslaved, became a symbol of how war corrupts even the most civilized societies. The economic devastation was equally severe. Attica's countryside, repeatedly ravaged by Spartan armies, took generations to recover. The olive groves that had been the foundation of Athenian prosperity were destroyed, and many farms were permanently abandoned. The commercial networks that had made Athens wealthy were disrupted, and many never fully recovered. The psychological impact may have been the most lasting damage of all. The plague had shaken religious faith, while the war's brutality had undermined belief in justice and divine providence. The philosophical schools that emerged in the war's aftermath, cynicism, stoicism, and Epicureanism, all reflected a world-weary skepticism about traditional values and institutions. The Peloponnesian War became a case study in the rise and fall of great powers. Thucydides, who lived through these events as both participant and observer, wrote his history as a possession for all time, a guide for future generations facing similar challenges. The war demonstrated how quickly fortune could change in international relations. Athens, which had seemed invincible at the war's beginning, was brought low by a combination of overreach, bad luck, and strategic mistakes. Sparta, which had appeared hopelessly outmatched by Athenian naval power, ultimately triumphed through persistence and adaptability. The conflict also revealed the dangers of imperial overstretch. Athens' attempt to maintain an empire while fighting a major war proved beyond its resources. The Sicilian expedition, in particular, showed how ambition could lead to catastrophic miscalculation. Perhaps most importantly, the war illustrated the fragility of democratic institutions under stress. The Athenian assembly, which had been a model of citizen participation in peacetime, became increasingly erratic and vindictive as the war dragged on. The execution of the Arginuside generals showed how fear and frustration could corrupt even the most enlightened political systems. The Peloponnesian War's influence extended far beyond ancient Greece. Roman historians studied it as a guide to understanding the rise and fall of empires. Medieval and Renaissance scholars saw parallels between Athens and their own city-states. Modern military academies still analyze its battles and strategies. The war's political lessons proved equally enduring. The tension between democracy and empire that plagued Athens would resurface throughout history. The challenge of maintaining domestic freedom while exercising international power remains relevant to modern democracies. Thucydides' analysis of the war's causes, fear, honor, and interest, became a foundation of political realism. His insight that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must influenced thinkers from Machiavelli to modern international relations theorists. The war also marked the end of the classical Greek world's golden age. The confident humanism that had produced the Parthenon and the tragedies of Sophocles gave way to a more introspective and pessimistic worldview. The philosophical schools that emerged in the war's aftermath focused on individual salvation rather than civic engagement. Yet the war's end also opened new possibilities. The weakening of Athens and Sparta created opportunities for other powers to rise. Within a generation, Philip of Macedon would begin the conquests that his son Alexander would extend to the ends of the known world. The Peloponnesian War stands as one of history's great tragedies, a conflict that destroyed much of what it sought to preserve. Athens fought to maintain its empire and democratic way of life, but the war's demands ultimately corrupted both. Sparta fought to preserve traditional Greek independence, but its victory led to a hegemony as oppressive as the one it had replaced. In the end, both sides lost more than they gained. Athens survived but never again dominated the Greek world. Sparta's victory proved hollow, as the responsibilities of empire proved beyond its capabilities. Within 30 years of the war's end, both cities would be overshadowed by the rising power of Macedon. The war's greatest lesson may be that some victories are too expensive to win. The cost of the Peloponnesian War, in lives, resources, and moral authority, exceeded any possible benefit. It showed that even the mightiest powers are vulnerable to the corrosive effects of prolonged conflict. Yet the war also demonstrated the resilience of human civilization. Despite decades of destruction, Greek culture survived and eventually flourished again. The political and philosophical insights gained from this terrible experience would influence Western thought for millennia to come. The Peloponnesian War reminds us that the price of greatness is often higher than we expect. It warns against the dangers of pride, the corruption of power, and the seductive appeal of military solutions to political problems. Most importantly, it shows that in war, even the victors can lose everything that made victory worth seeking. Found this epic tale of ancient warfare and political intrigue fascinating, the Peloponnesian War offers timeless lessons about power, democracy, and human nature that remain relevant today. If this deep dive into one of history's most consequential conflicts resonated with you, hit that like button and let us know in the comments which aspect of the war you found most compelling. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth explorations of the battles, personalities, and political dramas that shaped the ancient world. Share this with anyone who loves epic historical narratives. Together we can keep these crucial lessons from the past alive for future generations to learn from.